In 2017, China sent Venezuela $750 million, not as aid, as a loan, repayable in oil. By 2023, Venezuela owed China over $20 billion, most of it paid back in barrels, not bills. While Washington talked about democracy and human rights, Beijing was signing contracts, long ones. This isn't a story about a failing state. It's a story about two superpowers quietly fighting over who controls the oil under someone else's feet. And the battlefield isn't in Asia. It's 90 miles from Florida. This isn't about Venezuela. It's US versus China. And what's happening right now will decide far more than who governs Caracas. Let's start with a number most people don't know. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. Not Saudi Arabia, not Russia, Venezuela. 304 billion barrels. That's the official estimate. Some analysts think it's higher. For context, the United States has about 47 billion barrels in proven reserves. Saudi Arabia has around 260. So Venezuela isn't just oil-rich, it's absurdly, almost unfairly oil-rich. And for decades, that made it important to Washington. Not because the US needed the oil necessarily, but because no one else could have it, especially not a rival. Then something changed. In the late 90s and early 2000s, Hugo Chavez came to power. He nationalized the oil industry. He picked fights with Washington. He aligned with Cuba, Iran, and Russia. And when the US imposed sanctions, Venezuela's economy started to collapse. Inflation exploded. The currency became worthless. Millions fled the country. Oil production, which once hit 3 million barrels a day, fell below 500,000. It looked like a humanitarian disaster, and it was, but it was also an opening. Because when the US walked away, someone else walked in: China. Here's what most people miss. China didn't help Venezuela because it cared about socialism or sovereignty. It helped because it saw an opportunity to lock in energy access for the next 30 years. Starting in 2007, China began offering Venezuela loans, billions of dollars, infrastructure projects, telecom systems, political support at the UN. But these weren't charity deals. The loans came with a condition: repayment in oil. Not cash, not bonds, oil. Venezuela would ship crude directly to China at pre-agreed prices, often below market rates. The oil would go straight to Chinese state-owned refineries. This structure did two things. First, it gave China a guaranteed supply of cheap oil, insulated from global price shocks. Second, it locked Venezuela into dependency. Because once you owe someone $20 billion and you're paying them back in your only export, you don't have much room to maneuver.
By 2015, China had become Venezuela's largest creditor. It controlled port access. It built power grids. It supplied surveillance technology. It wasn't conquest, it was contract law. And it worked. Because while Washington was writing op-eds about democracy, Beijing was signing 30-year oil agreements. Now, if you're in Washington, this is where the alarms start going off. Not because you care deeply about Venezuela's internal politics, but because you care very deeply about who controls energy in your hemisphere. The Western Hemisphere has historically been considered unofficially U.S. strategic territory. The Monroe Doctrine, written in 1823, essentially said, Europe stays out and we stay dominant. That doctrine was never really about protecting Latin America. It was about making sure no major power could use Latin America as a base to challenge U.S. influence. For most of the 20th century, that worked. The Soviet Union tried to gain a foothold in Cuba. That nearly triggered nuclear war. But China's approach is different. China doesn't send troops, it sends loans. It doesn't install missiles, it installs 5G networks. And in Venezuela, it now controls a significant share of the country's oil output, its infrastructure, and its debt. That oil flows to China. Those revenues fund Chinese geopolitical priorities. That influence extends across Latin America, where China is now the top trading partner for Brazil, Chile, and Peru. From a U.S. perspective, this is a red line being crossed in slow motion. Because it's not just about oil, it's about precedent. If China can establish a permanent economic and energy presence in Venezuela, what stops it from doing the same in Colombia, Ecuador, Mexico? Suddenly, the hemisphere isn't just U.S. territory anymore. It's contested space. And that changes everything. So what did the U.S. do? It turned to sanctions, lots of them. In 2019, the Trump administration imposed sweeping sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector. It blocked U.S. companies from buying Venezuelan crude. It froze assets. It blacklisted tankers. The stated goal was to pressure the Maduro government, to restore democracy, to stop human rights abuses. But there was another effect. The sanctions made it much harder for China to extract and transport Venezuelan oil. Because even though China owned the contracts, it still needed international shipping, insurance, and banking systems to move the oil. And most of those systems are dominated by the U.S. and its allies. So suddenly, China's investment was stuck. The oil was there, the contracts were signed, but getting the oil out, refining it, and selling it became legally and logistically complicated. It didn't stop China, but it slowed them down. And that's the point. The U.S. wasn't trying to destroy Venezuela's oil industry. It was trying to make sure China couldn't fully benefit from it. Venezuela became a choke point, a way to limit China's energy security without directly confronting China. And here's the uncomfortable part. It worked. Sort of. Chinese oil imports from Venezuela dropped. Some Chinese state firms pulled back. The cost of doing business went up. But China didn't leave. It adjusted. It started using shadowy shipping networks. It rerouted oil through third countries. It kept lending. Because for China, this isn't about one country. It's about the long game. And in the long game, Venezuela is a test case.
Let's zoom out. This isn't really about Venezuela. Venezuela is the board. The pieces are oil, money, and influence. And the two players are the U.S. and China. For the U.S., the goal is containment. Keep China out of the Western Hemisphere. Prevent it from securing alternative energy supplies that bypass U.S.-controlled shipping lanes. For China, the goal is diversification. Reduce dependence on Middle Eastern oil that has to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, which the U.S. Navy controls. Venezuela offers a backdoor, a supply route that doesn't go through a choke point the U.S. can shut down. And it's not the only one. China has been making similar moves in Africa, in Central Asia, in the Middle East. It's building pipelines, ports, and refineries. It's signing long-term contracts with countries the West has abandoned or sanctioned. Iran, Russia, Sudan, Angola. These aren't random, they're deliberate. They're part of a strategy to create an alternative energy system that doesn't depend on U.S. permission. And Venezuela is a critical piece of that puzzle. Because if China can maintain access to Venezuelan oil, even under sanctions, it proves the model works. It shows other countries that they don't need to choose between Washington and Beijing. They can take Chinese money, ignore U.S. pressure, and survive. That's the real threat. Not that Venezuela becomes a Chinese colony, but that it becomes a template. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable.
The U.S. has spent years sanctioning Venezuela. It's isolated the government. It's recognized an opposition leader as the legitimate president. It's frozen billions in assets. And yet, Maduro is still in power. China is still there. The oil is still flowing. So what did the sanctions actually accomplish? They collapsed the Venezuelan economy. They pushed millions into poverty. They triggered one of the largest refugee crises in the Western Hemisphere. But they didn't remove Maduro, and they didn't remove China. In fact, they may have done the opposite. Because when the U.S. sanctions a country, it forces that country to find alternative partners. And the most willing alternative partner right now is China. So by isolating Venezuela, the U.S. may have pushed it further into Beijing's arms. This is the paradox of economic warfare. You take an action to solve a problem, and the action creates a bigger problem. The U.S. wanted to weaken Venezuela. It did. But in doing so, it handed China a distressed asset at a discount. And now, unwinding that is much harder. So where does this go? Right now, the U.S. is in a bind. If it lifts sanctions, it legitimizes Maduro and allows China to entrench further. If it keeps sanctions, it prolongs the humanitarian crisis and ensures China remains the only major player willing to engage. There's no clean option. And this dynamic isn't unique to Venezuela. You're seeing it play out in multiple countries. The U.S. imposes sanctions, China offers loans. The country becomes dependent. The U.S. loses influence. Rinse, repeat. The problem is that sanctions work best when you have alternatives to offer, when you can say, cut ties with them and we'll help you instead. But the U.S. hasn't been offering that. It's been offering pressure without partnership. China, meanwhile, offers money without lectures. It doesn't care about your human rights record. It doesn't care about your democracy score. It cares about resources, markets, and long-term contracts. And for a lot of countries, especially those already isolated by the West, that's an attractive deal. So the real question isn't whether the U.S. can push China out of Venezuela. The question is whether the U.S. can compete with China's model globally. Because if it can't, Venezuela is just the beginning. You'll see this same pattern in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East. Countries will take Chinese infrastructure loans. They'll default. China will take equity in ports, mines, and oil fields. The U.S. will complain, but it won't have a counteroffer. And slowly, the global energy map will shift. Not through war, through debt. Here's what most people still don't understand. The U.S.-China rivalry isn't being fought with aircraft carriers and missiles, not yet anyway. It's being fought with loans, oil contracts, and infrastructure deals. And the battlefield isn't the South China Sea. It's Venezuela, it's Zambia, it's Pakistan. These countries aren't choosing sides because they love one superpower over the other. They're choosing whoever shows up with money when they're desperate. And right now, China is showing up. The U.S. is still operating like it's 1995, like it can sanction a country and expect the world to fall in line. But the world has options now, and those options speak Mandarin. Venezuela is the test case, the proof of concept. China is proving that you can survive U.S. sanctions if you're willing to accept Chinese terms. And if that's true, then the entire sanctions-based foreign policy model is in trouble. Because once countries realize they don't need U.S. permission to access global markets, the leverage disappears. And leverage, more than military power, is what keeps empires running. So the real story isn't what's happening in Caracas, it's what's being decided in Washington and Beijing. Who controls the oil? Who writes the contracts? Who gets to decide which countries are allowed to develop and on whose terms? Venezuela was just where that fight became visible. But the fight is everywhere. And it's not close to over.